This lecture for History 370 is Section 10, Resettling East Asia from approximately 1990 to the year 2000. Our objectives for this section are, first of all, to see how things have kind of settled. There have, of course, been changes in China, Japan, and Korea, and the various divisions within them, such as the Republic of China and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. But for the most part, there haven't been any big, huge, major changes since the year 2000, right? So in a sense, this section is trying to help us understand the history from the 1990s to 2000. What's very important about that decade is, in a sense, things have become fairly standard. I'm not saying there haven't been changes. There have been changes, but they tend to not be revolutionary changes. They tend to be things that we could kind of expect in some ways. We're going to note how the importance of the rise of a hegemonic power in each country reached a consensus on reform based on a focus on economic growth, right? So what I mean by this is that, with one exception, which we'll talk about later, in China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea and Taiwan, we've had a group of people rise to power within the government, business, it depends on the different country, but you have this group of people who rise to power who say, you know what? The consensus for our country is economic growth. That's what we need to focus on. And underlying that idea is this idea that this economic growth needs to be shared. We need to make sure a lot of people take part in this economic growth, that people's lives get better. And so even though there's going to be different kinds of political systems, one thing that is similar about China, both the Republic of China and the People's Republic of China, Japan and the Republic of Korea, is that all came to an agreement to focus on economic growth, right? And that's going to transform them. Now, politically, they're going to do things a little bit differently, as we'll talk about here, but they did focus on economic growth and making that kind of distribution. The one exception in which the hegemonic power does not want reform is North Korea, right? The Democratic People's Republic of Korea. That's the one exception that did not want economic reform, and it has not made those kinds of promises to its people. We'll talk more about that, why that is, later. And interesting enough, it's the one place where things have gotten worse. Very few people in Japan, South Korea, any of those places, China, would say, you know what? We want to go back to the way things were in the 60s. Now, there was some good things going on in the 60s, don't get me wrong. That's when Japan and Korea were enjoying, for example, a lot of economic growth. However, the economic growth had not yet taken place. We have to remember that's when they're having to really, really work hard and work at crazy long hours and things like that. You don't want to go to that. You want to go, no one's going to say, let's go back to that, or very few people would say that. Right? So there's a feeling in those countries that things have gotten better, right? In many ways of measuring, things have gotten better for Koreans in the South, for Chinese, for Japanese, from the 1950s and 60s. Definitely, clearly from the 50s. North Korea is the one, again, exception to that. For North Koreans, things in many ways have gotten worse. Right? In North Korea, things were going really well in the 1960s in many ways, even into the 70s. But things have gotten worse. And unlike these other countries, North Korea has decided not to pursue economic development. So we'll be looking at that, right, as we go through this history. We're also going to try and understand some potential flashpoints that could unsettle the region again. Right? We're now at a place where things are kind of settled. What could unsettle it? The 1980s, especially the latter half, witnessed in Asia a period of democratization. In the Philippines in 1986, there was the so-called People Power Revolution, in which longtime dictator Ferdinand Marcos was forced to give up his resign the presidency, basically, and to flee the country, and it was replaced by a democratically elected government. And as we've talked about before in this class, the same thing is going to happen in South Korea. In 1987, Chun Doo-hwan is forced to accept that the next election will be open and democratic. Right. So in the late 1980s in Asia, including East Asia, there's a shift towards democracy. There is an attempt to do this as well in Tiananmen Square in China. We discussed this. It did not work out for the pro-democracy people. In this case, the government was able to crush this rising. Right? They were able to crush this demonstration. Now, the Communist Party was patting itself on the back saying we did a good job, right? Why do I say that? This is why. The Tiananmen Square incident was in the summer of 1989. In the fall of 1989, there was a series of revolutions in Eastern Europe that overthrew every communist government in Eastern Europe. Sometimes, mostly non-violently, sometimes violently, but they were all gone. And so what this said to the Communist Party in China was, A, we did the right thing by suppressing this, and B, democratization poses an existential threat to our party, to our power, right? We cannot allow democracy, right? We cannot allow democracy. If we just open the door just a little bit, we may fall just like them, right? So we have to take a tough stand against democracy. The problem is, you can say, hey, let's take a tough stand against democracy, but you can't just simply kill people to stay in power, right? Governments that just try and stay in power through violence don't last long. The Communist Party had to figure out a way to rebuild its legitimacy. And to do that, it needed to answer the question, why did people participate in the democracy movement, right? Why were people supportive of this? Not only why did students participate, why did the people in the middle participate? Why did workers participate? Why, with the exception of the peasants, who didn't really seem to care much about the movement, why did so many people in the cities support this movement? And the answer pretty much boiled down to economic reasons, right? So for example, one reason the students were so nervous and upset was because they were worried there weren't going to be jobs. They thought democracy would give them a say in how society was run and give them a say in economic policy that would help them to get jobs. Likewise, another major issue was corruption. That was often economic in nature. The communist people in the Communist Party used their connections to enrich themselves economically, right? So the government said, okay, we need to deal with the economic issues. Another issue was economic inequality, right? Some people were getting really rich. Some people were staying poor. All right. If we can deal with those economic issues, then there won't be so much support for democracy, right? If democratic demands are driven by the economic problems, if we solve the economic problems, you won't have the democratic demands. Very simple. It took a couple years to kind of get this going, but in 1992, the communist government officially rededicated itself to more systematic economic reform. In particular, it sought more integration with the global economy. So it's going to seek economic reform because economic reform can make people wealthier, can deal with these economic problems that will allow the Communist Party to stay in power. And one thing that's very important is they allowed new elites into the Communist Party. The Communist Party had traditionally been made up of mostly peasants and workers, or people whose ancestors had been peasants or workers. But now they're saying, okay, business people, you want to be part of the Communist Party? That's fine. Scientists, educators, people with any kind of advanced education, now you can become a member of the Communist Party. Well, as the saying goes, if you can't beat them, join them. I can rebel against the Communist Party, or I could seek to join the Communist Party and maybe make some changes on the inside while not taking a risk of being thrown in jail and beaten up and things like that. And if you think, doesn't that sound a lot like the exam systems? You're exactly right. It's the same thing. Integrate elites into the government so they do not oppose the government. And here's the thing. This worked really, really, really well in terms of developing the economy. Right? China for decades enjoyed double-digit economic growth. So this turned out to be a really, really good strategy. Right? It's going to work really well in developing the economy and dealing with a lot of those economic concerns that people had. The other side of how communist China is going to rebuild its legitimacy, right? And this actually starts, in a sense, officially before the economic policy, is the development of what was called Patriotic Education. Right? So in 1991, the Chinese government instituted Patriotic Education in the schools. And the idea was to teach children, love China. Right? China is awesome. China is great. Love China. And in 1994, it was decided to expand this further to include also the rest of society, particularly the army. Now, this may not sound that, what can I say, pioneering in a sense, or may not sound that different, but remember, China is officially a communist country. But instead of focusing on class conflict or something like that, they're focusing on patriotism, right? Instead of focusing on, hey, these are the oppressors, they're oppressing us economically, isn't that terrible? They're saying, hey, we're all Chinese. We need to work together to make China great. Right? So instead of emphasizing on dividing Chinese people based on economic class, as they had done in the Cultural Revolution and the previous periods, they're going to focus on uniting Chinese based on their shared Chineseness, their shared nationalism. This will include the publication of a textbook with texts from Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Jiang Zemin. You don't need to remember Jiang Zemin's name, but I just want to give him an example. He is a successor of Deng Xiaoping, who will follow his economic policies. So they keep Mao around, but they're careful about what texts they select from Mao, and they make sure they have Deng and Jiang Zemin, Deng's successor, who was a protege of Deng, to balance those out. And what's fascinating is this patriotic education, it focuses on pre-1949 chaos. It does not focus on the Great Leap Forward. It does not focus on the Cultural Revolution. Those are times when the Communist Party messed up. It doesn't focus on them. It focuses on pre-1949 chaos, which we've talked a lot about in this class, and argues that this chaos was fundamentally caused by China's weakness and by division. So in order to avoid that weakness, caused in a large part by that division, to make a strong and powerful and prosperous China, you need a strong leadership. You got that. You got the Communist Party. They're the strong leadership who have built a powerful and prosperous China. And if you try and change horses now, if you try and change how you're doing things now, that could lead to division, that could lead to weakness. So by golly, you got to stick with the Communist Party, because otherwise you're not patriotic. You don't love your country. Why? Because if you were opposed to the Communist Party, that could bring division and weakness, and we know what that led to before 1949. And one thing I want to point out, though, like all good propaganda, this has some truth to it. Things were bad before 1949. Things are much better in China now. Now, one thing I have to point out, though, this can be at times rather dangerous, because the people can sometimes be more nationalistic than the state, right? Sometimes nationalism among Chinese people is stronger than it is among the government. The government has to try and control it. Otherwise, the Chinese people can try and pressure the government into taking action that can cause diplomatic problems, right? Which is kind of interesting. We have to remember the Chinese government, in many ways, is afraid of the people, which is why they don't allow people to watch YouTube and things like that. And I just want to point out, this is an example of a patriotic education textbook. The Chinese at the bottom there says, love our China. And one thing we have to understand about China is that the Chinese had the freedom to enjoy their prosperity. So to give you an example, in the Soviet Union and in Eastern European countries, they actually tried to ban jeans, like Levi's. They said these were signs of decadent Western culture, that they were bad, and so forth. They actually tried to ban jeans. And they had police assigned to dealing with jeans, because jeans are very dangerous, apparently. This is one reason their governments fell. They try to control these aspects of people's lives that, it would be nice for people to have some freedom in. China doesn't try and do anything that crazy. Right? If you can make money in China and you can enjoy that prosperity. You have a lot of freedom in terms of what you buy and what you wear and so forth, as long as you have the money. There are limits to this. You cannot challenge the government too much. You can sometimes challenge individual officials, especially if they are acting in a corrupt way. There are lots of, there's some freedom on the internet to voice your opinion. There's also people who censor the internet, and you can't watch YouTube without using a VPN in China or some other means of getting around it. But young people are pretty smart, good at doing that kind of thing. So even though China and Chinese people don't have as much freedom as, say, people in the United States, the fact is, in many respects, they enjoy a great deal of freedom to enjoy their prosperity. And for many people, that's good enough. And so for this reason, you still have a Communist Party in power in China. It's brought people economic development. They had to sacrifice a lot for it, but it was under the Communist Party's leadership that that occurred. And people had the freedom to enjoy that prosperity within certain limits, but they more freedom than they used to have. And of course, it's understood that now China is strong. People have to take it seriously. That happened under the leadership of the Communist Party. Let's stick with them for now, at least. However, there is a significant problem, I think, for many Chinese people. And it's this kind of frustration. And I think it showed up in this interesting book interview I was listening to. It's called, I listen to the New Books Network sometimes when I'm working, doing some light work. It's and they interview authors about their books. And there's a very interesting book about the how Americans consumed Japanese culture in the 1980s, which is fascinating to me as someone who was born in 1978. And what was interesting about this interview was the host asked the author, so why isn't China cool? Right? Why isn't China cool in the same way Japan is cool? Right? Or we could even say, why isn't China cool in the same way that South Korea is cool? Right? I mean, think about this. Much of East Asian civilization does have its origins in China. China is an incredibly powerful economy. But why isn't that people are not consuming Chinese pop bands like they do K-pop, right? Why don't we talk so much about C-pop? We talk about K-pop, but not C-pop. Why aren't people outside of China watching Chinese dramas like they're watching Korean dramas? Why aren't Chinese comics and animation similar to in popularity to Japan? And this is something that's kind of frustrating for many people in China. And one problem has to do, I think, with this issue of freedom. Right? And one thing I think would be interesting to be on the lookout for, in our lifetime, does China become cool? Right? Is China going to allow enough freedom that it can exercise what should be a very powerful popular culture muscle? Right? China has been great at influencing other countries throughout history, has been great in developing culture that many people thought was interesting and they thought was useful and that made their lives better. Can China do it again? And a lot of that, I think, will have to do with giving Chinese people the freedom to be creative. Will it happen? I hope so. With each of these sections, I want to kind of try and emphasize that, East Asia in many ways isn't that far away. You can hop on a flight and be in East Asia within a day. And of course, there's also people from East Asia here in Greenwood. And I have this picture here to kind of remind you all of that. The woman in the middle is from Korea, but the woman on the right, Ani Shur, is from China. And she took a couple of my classes and was a huge history fan, very, very patriotic person, but also very willing to listen to what other people had to say. And I think she's an example of the kind of rising youth in China. And here is Annie presenting at the Student Academic Symposium. She, of course, talked about Chinese characters and has a deep knowledge of those and deep passion for sharing Chinese language. And I just want to share, because I think this is just a fun interaction. In my History of Japan class, I had some essay questions where students could draw their answers, because I had a bunch of art students, and Japanese culture lends itself, I think, to drawing essay answers. And she included a caricature of me with me saying, "Stories go more exciting." I think she means stories make things more exciting. But in any case, I thought that was a spot on caricature, and it was really funny. And I just like to showcase that because I want to emphasize politics, whatever, causes conflict and division, but we could still have personal relationships. It can be quite humorous and a lot of fun. And that's one thing I hope that having gone through this class, you won't look at these different cultures and civilizations as just collectives of faceless people. I want you to kind of see the personalities that are there and the possibilities of forming good human relationships that we can all enjoy together. And I had to include this picture. I thought it was really funny. On the right is a Korean woman who is a friend of mine. On the left is another friend of mine. They were roommates in college. She is from Taiwan and is kind of a Taiwanese nationalist. She does not want Taiwan to become a part of China again. She wants Taiwan basically to be independent. So it's kind of interesting, that sort of relationship. But there they are dressed as Korean court ladies, which I think was kind of funny.